Hi everyone and welcome to Fan Commentary on Green with Evil Part 1. A lot of people today will not really understand why Green with Evil was such a big deal back in 1993. What it is that in those days, kid shows were very simplistic. They were great as they were. I've loved all those old shows like Tailspin, DuckTales. They were your standard adventure shows that would, every now and again do a multi-parter, but for the most part would be a standalone story with not many big stakes. And the only thing that really had a dramatic stuff for kids at the time was really Batman the Animated Series that happened a year before in 1992. And why this worked so well is probably because it throws the audience in, fear. As a kid, you love your heroes, but the worst thing you can do is see your heroes being, their powers, or even just seeing another human being versus like the Rangers fighting monsters, fighting back with their same abilities, especially when you see Tommy here, who set it up to be roughly equal to Jason, which, was a big deal at the time. What makes this also more amazing is how the writers, worked around the Japanese footage of Zyurangers because this was the really big thing too. Happily enough, at the same time, Zyuranger was the first time a Six Ranger premiered on Super Sentai. This was not a thing in the past. Why was this so popular? Well, it destroys the safety net that Zordon and Alpha 5 and the Command Center gave the Rangers because, all they have is their powers and their ability to, defend themselves, fight, and, deal with problems. Zordon has been their father figure for, a good chunk of the season, and now they're going to be, cut off from him. And in a way, it's almost preying on like what would happen if your family had gotten into a car accident of some kind and you were in doubt of what would happen. It preyed on those things that came close to you. This episode unfortunately really suffered in the reversion of MMPR, where even though a lot of this is not even a real fight, it's just a martial arts tournament. They're not making direct physical contact. This was still heavily censored with a lot of annoying visual effects. They were trying to keep the Japanese styling with text and stuff. It really didn't add to the scene. It was very annoying when I saw it, and it was just there to censor it, which was very obvious. What I also love is the stump actors, Jason, Austin St. John and Jason Frank, did a really good job at, introducing each other here. But also the choreographer took his time to, look at the Japanese footage and be like, well, the stunt performers in Zyuranger did this, this, and this, and we need to make it feel very similar. That's why Jason and Tommy have a very specific fighting style. They go for more kicking, more, torso blows with their punching. This was a turning point for the series. If it wasn't for the Green Ranger arc, I think Power Rangers would have just ended as the intended 40 episode season and it would have been forgotten out of time because this show was unique when it first premiered because we really didn't have a lot of live action TV series at the time. It was mainly cartoons and animated shows, and maybe a few things taken from Japan brought over here like Voltron, but we never had a live action show that was geared toward kids in this manner. There was other things like science shows, but not this. And this is what really gravitated me to the show because I have always loved martial arts. It was a really big impression toward a lot of people. And today when you watch Screen with Evil, it doesn't feel like this massive amazing thing. It's just, these things didn't exist at the time and when these were shown, because a lot of adventure shows like DuckTales and Tailspin, except for maybe key multi-parter episodes, they didn't have huge stakes or major issues where, wow, they can fail or lose or maybe someone dies. Power Rangers was the early ones that have done that, which is why, people really connected toward Tommy. The episode, when you watch it as an adult, though, you can see how hard it was in order to get this to work in MMPR, because, you can watch how, it's pretty rushed. It's a fast-paced episode. There's not much to it. We have to introduce Tommy and Jason. Have to see how they're equal in strength. Rita has to see him. He has to judge him, and then she has to take him to the palace in order to use the Zyuranger footage. There's a lot here to balance and put together. And of course, it's Japanese footage, so you have very limited parts to use. And of course, it's also dealing with the Burai footage, which is virtually unusable. It also causes a problem because the Dragon Ranger arc in the Zyuranger story wasn't really an arc. It was more of like standalone episodes. They introduced, of course, Dragon Ranger, the Green Ranger, and he was the big deal, but he kind of basically just simply pops in and out, which made this 5-parter very difficult to come up with. And when you hear the interviews from all the writers for this first season of MMPR, they didn't even know that the Green Ranger was in the show. When they were writing the show, they were just getting episodes as they came in, and then they had to come up with stories, which is the worst way to do an adaptation of footage. But again, they were low budget. That was the first time they were doing it, so they were just getting as whatever they could. And then this character came in, and they were like, this guy keeps coming back and coming back. It was just... This was like the lightning in the bottle, quite literally, where they got lucky and they were able to pull off something better than what Zyuranger did, because Zyuranger this was the first time, but the character was so limited. He was cool, but that's the reason why Zyuranger fans and MMPR fans don't have the similarities. It's not even because it's the first PR seasons that we have versus them having Go Ranger. They would be more attached to the first years there. They just didn't really care about the 16th season because, well, it was the Green Ranger and it was a new character. It wasn't a big deal. Now, this is the actual footage of waking up Burai in Zyuranger. Long story short, Burai was actually, tombed in a similar way of how the other Zyurangers were, except his tomb was damaged. That's the reason why he was slowly dying through the season. If you look closer, you can actually see Burai right there. This is the only real time we get to see his face. Then it fades, of course, to Jason Frank. So they had to work this around, because it's like, how do you bring this character in, because, he was sealed away millions of years ago, and that's the story we never used, so it's like, what do we do? And this brings up a lot of questions to fans. And you could have taken this in so many different directions, because why does Rita have a Green Ranger coin? It's possible that, she stole it. She was the originator of the power coins, or maybe Zordon was the one who stole them, and he was the one who maybe took an evil power and turned him into good. There were so many different directions they could have gone, and that's what I thought of as a fan. I was like, wow, they just opened up the door for so many different types of things. Now, let me talk about the Green Ranger suit. Of course, in MMPR Season 1, they were not really good with the mimicking or copying the Japanese suits at all. And it was always weird because you can see the power coin is not inside his Morphin. It really didn't make any sense. But again, I guess they couldn't do the whole thing, because how is he going to grab it without looking down? And also he has the gloves on, so they just probably had it always in his hand. Now, the whole Green Ranger shield, when I originally saw the show, I always thought it was because they had really no money to replicate the Zyuranger shield, which was much more superior. When I found out Jason Frank actually was the one who requested them to make this very inferior foam shield that didn't look that good, so he can actually move in it, because sometimes he was in the suit to do these scenes. And unfortunately, it never looked good, and I wish they had used a better shield. Which again, later in future seasons, they did come up with a pretty good matched MMPR suit with just the minor issues. But in the first iteration of this, it was lackluster. Now the destruction of the command center was pretty big for someone who was like 7 or 8 years old, because they just violated your room basically, and it was like shocking. And then of course Alpha was infected with a virus, although it was kind of cheap that they just used some random CD and they stuck him in the back. That's one of the unfortunate issues with low budget. But right now Zordon is disconnected, and it kind of you now realize that the command center is kind of acts like a magnet to keep him tethered to this dimensional plane. Now, again, here is more odd editing because, again, they're working around the first 2 episodes of Zyuranger, and it doesn't really work so much. You can kind of see when you rewatch the show, you'll realize, oh, this footage is taken from this episode later on. That's actually in Green with Evil Part 4, and then they have to reuse it. And I will always have a nitpick in this episode. Now, Tommy had infiltrated the command center, almost killed Zordon by, getting him disconnected from the dimension, and Alpha's now offline. How come he didn't go after the Zords and disable them? Because if he had done that, they would have won. Well, obviously, in show reason, is because they had to use the Japanese footage, and that issue was not in Zyuranger. That he did not, in any way, go into the underground base in Zyurangers and attack them like that. He always was with Bandora. They were actually lucky that they did this whole rad bug thing, because this was just a one-off episode in Zyuranger, the whole rad bug thing, and they didn't have to adapt it, so they were lucky that they had the foresight to think ahead and have this backup vehicle, which unfortunately gets forgotten about after honestly after this, and I think there's only used 1 or 2 more times. So this came in handy whenever the teleporting system went down. This works so much more better because, at the time in 93, we were not really familiarized with computers and how they worked, so this was more impactful. But today's standards, what he does with a CD-ROM, and, like how Alpha gets like a virus, but then he's fine now, then later on he isn't. I like how Amy Jo kind of missed her mark and wasn't paying attention. She was acting with Alpha over there in the back. Now, of course, again, like I said, with Zyuranger, this is a ton of material that has to be all edited around. There's a lot of material that's going off screen with Barza and Bandora and a few other monsters. And, that's why we have this random stuff with Goldar. And of course, we have to have this is the first time we actually use more of the US Green Ranger material, because they cannot use any of the Burai footage at all, because right now he's just, talking to her and whatnot. There's also footage taken from a few other episodes. This footage is also repeated fairly often on MMPR, mainly this Goldar fight. It gets used a lot. It was their go-to footage of Goldar because it was probably the longest fight they had where him alone. You can also see how they leave some shots lingering, and in this case, they'll do the full Megazord transformation, including forming the Power Coins crystals, which they dropped not too long after this because it says Zyuranger on it. It's just there to, use as much time up as possible, which, honestly, if they didn't have that much material, they could have added a couple of extra scenes for Zordon and Alpha before they, before he went into the command center. I think that would have added to it instead of just, lingering on a few extra things here. Of course, they have to have a Megazord sequence, and of course, it has to use the Zyuranger footage, but it's pretty tricky if you ever watch the original episode on Zyuranger how this worked out. Like I said, in Zyuranger, these episodes were not multi-parters. These were self-contained episodes where we'll have the introductory episode of Dragon Ranger, and then we'll go into another standalone episode, and then I think one episode later we would be introduced to Lamy, which was in part 3 and 4 of Green with Evil. It's very complicated how they had to restructure this story and from Zyuranger's multiple material into this 5-parter. Honestly, they could have whittled it down to 4 parts, but they wanted it to go for an entire week. Which I wouldn't be surprised the reason why they did a 5-parter. It was for them to, in order to build up more stories, because right now they didn't know how long this character was going in, like they said, and they were probably like, well, how can we adapt future episodes, and how do we bring in this Green Ranger character? So they probably used the 5-parter in order to give them extra time. This is also a very rare case in PR where the evil ranger will fight them for a very long time. We don't really get to see this much. I like that he actually threw the weapon because he doesn't use any of their weapons. And you could see here, this is where you could see Jason and Tommy's civilian fight mimics the fight in the ranger suits. Now, I always wondered, where did this magic ability of this energy ball go to when he became good? He doesn't even use it after this point. It's just this shown like once, and that's it. We never see this ability ever again. Even Zyuranger is guilty of this. People also use this episode in order to get really good close-ups of all the consoles, because, fans always like to see how they were built with various different pieces and doodads. Even the show reused this material because it was reused in season 2. Some shots were taken over here as well. Yeah, this I never really cared for because he was affected by the virus. Again, it's plot reasons. It's not really that good. But it's a minor nitpick that you can overlook for a fairly good, decent MMPR episode. For the time, this was the most amazing thing, most dramatic in PR standards, and a lot of kids really loved this moment in the show, which is what solidified it to becoming a franchise. So whether you hate Tommy or you hate the what he became, you have to owe a lot of things to potentially this 5-parter because it opened up the world instead of having the Monster of the Week story. It's like, what will happen next? So many different ways they could have gone, but they played it safe, and I think they did a really good job.